Turn with me to Romans chapter 1. We're going to be looking this morning at verses 18 through 32, which are verses that would be under the category, if you had to put one, of it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So this is a heavy passage. It's a weighty passage. And I'm hoping it'll be an encouragement to us in the end. And so we're going to look at this morning. Verses 18 through 32 fall on the heels of verses 16 through 17 because I can do math. And verses 16 and 17 are the theme kind of the entire book of Romans. I am not ashamed of the gospel because of the power of God to save everyone who believes, to bring salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, and it is made plain to everyone who believes from faith. It is by faith from first to last, as it is written, the just will live by faith. Those are glorious verses. It is the power of God to save everyone. And on that, Paul turns. And the transition from verses 17 to 18 are sort of like this. Let's say I call you up on your birthday no less, and tell you that I've got a present for you. I have a birthday gift for you. Can I come over right now and give it to you? You say, sure it is. Sure, come on and give it to me. And you don't know this yet, but this is the most expensive gift I've ever bought. It costs thousands and thousands of dollars. And I get out of my car with this gift with a smile on my face. It's your birthday after all. And I knock on the door, you open the door, and I present to you this beautifully wrapped gift. I love you. You're a dear friend of mine. Happy birthday. I hand you this gift, and you rip open the beautiful packaging, and you open it up, and you find in there 24 vials of a liquid, and you look at it, and at first you don't recognize it, unless you're terriers, and you realize that it is a very high-powered chemotherapy drug. And so you're thinking, you just gave me a lot of chemotherapy, and maybe, Jim, you know something I don't know. Maybe you would say to me, Jim, do I have cancer? And I would say, yes. And that's why I'm giving you this. Now, whatever you would feel in that moment is what you feel between verses 17 and 18. Because we've just been given this great, glorious, good news that God's power is saving people. Everyone who believes. Great. Why? What do we need to be saved from? Why do we need to be saved? Now, here's the alarming thing about verses 18 through 32. Whereas in other passages of Scripture, we are viewed as being saved from sin, not here. Here, we're being saved from God. We're being saved from God. Do you see what I mean by a sort of weighty passage? And so this is what the passage says. Just as the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel, so, verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to uncleanness for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen? Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. And in the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Therefore, furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve, celebrate those who practice them. Oh, man. Now, let me first point out some things from the structure of this passage, because the structure of this passage might seem like little theological details, but they'll actually guide your thinking into how we need to respond to this truth that has been clearly and forcefully laid out for us. The theme of verses 18 through 32 is in verse 18 when it says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men." God is mad because people are bad. So if you want to make a bumper sticker out of this, please don't. That's what it would be. God is mad because people are bad. But the questions are, how are people bad? What's wrong here? What really is the issue? And what we're going to be challenged here to see is the way God sees it. Because every single one of us in this room have a moral code. And we know we break it sometimes, but we sure know a lot of other people out there breaking our moral code. But the issue isn't what you and I think is right or wrong. The issue is what God sees. So what does God see as the human problem? What does God see as the problem from which people need saving? How does God view what is the nature of our sin or wickedness? Then the other question is, this passage says God's mad about it, right? Wrath. But it says the wrath of God is now being revealed. And my question is, how is the wrath of God now being revealed? Because some of us think that off in the future someday, those people are going to get what's coming to them because there's going to be a judgment, and there is. But that's not what this passage says. This passage says the wrath of God is now being revealed. Now, here's what you need to understand about the structure of this passage. Verses 18 through 23 are the first part, what's wrong with people. And verses 24 through 32 are how God is responding to it, how the wrath of God is being revealed upon this wrong. Now, you have to keep those things in mind, because if you mix them up, you'll think God is talking about one thing when he's really not. So let's look at this passage together and first ask ourselves, what is wrong? What is the human problem that is pointed out here? And here it is. So those of you who are keeping notes, this is what you want to write in your notes. Ready? I'll say it slowly. Misdirected worship is the fundamental sin and failure of mankind. Oh, did you think it was something else in one of those lists in the second part of the passage? No. The fundamental problem with human beings is misdirected worship. That's the problem. Look how he lays this out. He first demonstrates that everybody has been given ample evidence of God. When he says in verse 20, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his godness, including his eternal power, divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Look what it says, known, plain, clearly seen, understood. And it says later in the passage, they knew God. Here's the thing. people understand that there is a God out there. A few people in this world assert that God does not exist, and we call them atheists. Ironically, God says atheists don't exist. There's no such thing as an atheist, according to God, because ample evidence of God has been laid out, and it is incontrovertible. No, it isn't. People controvert it all the time. People deny it all the time. They don't see it. Yeah, because of what you're going to see in the second part of the passage. The reality is the truth of God's godness, the fact that He's there, is plain. And that knowledge is sufficient for people to worship Him and thank Him. That knowledge is sufficient for people to worship Him and thank Him. And that's what human beings are designed to do. That's what they're called to do. That's what's right. That's what's just. That's what's reasonable. But people have not. And so what does it say? For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God nor gave thanks to Him. Now just stop there and let that soak in, because that is what really makes God angry. That people don't glorify God or give thanks to Him. And let me just say, ingratitude is not a little sin of omission. Ingratitude calls down the wrath of God, because God has been good and generous. They neither glorified God or gave thanks to Him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. You see, human beings are incurably worshipers. We're built to do that, so we all worship something. And in truth, we're all tempted to worship all kinds of things. And either we're going to worship the Creator or we're going to worship anything else, which is by definition what He made. So you're going to worship the Creator or the creature. Everybody. By the way, you and I are creatures. And since we love ourselves so desperately, we often worship ourselves. We often put ourselves in the center of our own lives. That is the sin. That is the problem. That's what makes God angry. There is a God in this universe, and it's not you and me, and it's not those other things. Do you remember in your high school biology class when you dissected a frog? How many did that? Do people still do that? Or is it just us old people, all right? Dissect a frog is a fascinating thing. Now look, you might be grossed out by that because that's really not your thing. You might hate the smell of formaldehyde. I assume they're still using something like that. But here's this frog laid open. And your response to that dissected frog can be one of two things. You can just simply be in awe of the intricacies of this amphibian anatomy and how it all works. A simple frog, we run over them in the street and don't even slow down, right? But here it is. Here it is. It's like it's a beautiful thing. And you know what? You can either worship the frog or you can worship the God who made the frog. And if you think that's ridiculous, then what's not ridiculous about worshiping anything other than the God who is worthy of it? Right? Worshiping a frog? Yeah, reptiles. That's why he ended his list with reptiles, that kind of thing, right? Because that's what we've done. There's been a great exchange, exchanging the glory of God, of the immortal God, for images made to look like mortal man. And that is what makes God angry. People understand this. Listen, you go to anybody, you go to just about anybody on the street and say, listen, I'm going to pray for you. They'll say, thank you. Or, can I pray with you now? If you're not doing it in just a really weird place, most people will say, sure. Everybody's happy for you to pray for them because you may actually be talking to somebody. They don't know who that somebody is. He's the big man upstairs or whatever. But that knowledge is in there, and yet there is not a worshipful, grateful heart, bowing to the reality of that God, and that is the failure of human beings. That is the failure of all human beings, without exception and without excuse. And here's God's frightening response. Okay, so the first point was misdirected worship is the problem, and God's response is more degradation and darkness, or what we would call moral chaos, is the God-ordered consequence of man's rejection of God. Moral chaos is God's judgment on man's failure to worship him. Therefore, verse 24, you're going to see a word 3 times pounded in like pounding nails in a coffin in verses 24, 26, and 28. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to, the word is actually uncleanness. It's a very general word. And the reason NIV translates it sexual impurity is because of the phrase for the degrading of their bodies with one another. And so that is sort of the idea here. The point is that it affects the physical bodies. The giving over is a loss of something physically, is the point he's making. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. Because of this, God gave them over. So notice verse 24. Therefore, God gave them over. Verse 26. Because of this, see, he's talking about consequences. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged. Notice the word exchange. By the way, we've already seen that word twice in this passage. We exchanged our worship of God for worship of creatures. We exchanged the truth of God for a lie. So it should not be surprising if there's other exchanges that we make, and here's one of them. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men abandoned natural relations with women, were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. I'm going to talk about those 2 verses in just a minute. Wait a minute. Verse 28, furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over. So here's another consequence is, and another time he gave them over. He gave them up to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. And I don't want to read this list of sins, but you recognize in that some of the things that you and I struggle with. We're talking about a human condition that will not allow us to talk about them instead of us. Right? Seriously, do you not struggle with worship issues? Let me just confess for a minute. This morning, like I always do, I sit in my chair with my cup of coffee, first thing. And that's usually my best time to pray, but especially on Sundays, and that's my long habit. And Sunday I pray really over the nation and the world of people I know, loved ones and friends who are worshiping God. And I realize for some of them I'm praying for their church service that ended 5 hours ago. But anyway, God knows all about that stuff. So I'm sitting here praying, and I'm thinking about this morning, and I'm thinking about many of you, and I'm thinking about this passage, and I'm thinking about this service, and I'm praying for it. And then my mind goes to my truck in the driveway with parts of it taken off so I can repair it. And then my mind goes to say, I need my truck to do my work, including this job and this job, which I need to do this, and I'll do it this way, and then I got to get these done because we have some traveling we need to do here over the next few weeks, and I got to think of the route, and probably should reserve hotels, but I got to get the truck fixed. Do you see what I'm saying? What matters to me? What's important to me? At the very time, the very opportunity set aside to focus on God, spend time in His presence in prayer, in that very time, all these other important things God gave me, can become the focus of my attention. See, none of us are exempt from the problem of misdirected worship. And let me just tell you that upsets God. When we don't find Him big enough or important enough to capture our attention. We're not just talking about them, we're talking about us. Now you look out in this world, because you see in your lives redemption has taken place, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And so that has been a clear benefit, right, that makes our lives in our homes, in our hearts, in our minds, in our sphere of influence, it has made a real significant difference. But if you just look outside of that, right, to the world and the moral chaos, and we can have all kinds of reactions to that, but here's the point. Those things exist because God has let people go. Why are those people doing that? Because God let them go. That's why. Those people, God's not happy with it. They're gonna regret that. So they're already regretting it. They're already living in it. Picture this. You're in a tug of war. Remember we used to do that, have a tug of war? One team pulling against another, big rope. The fat guy on the back ties the rope around him, you know what I mean? You figure, if nothing else, he can fall over and be a boat anchor for us, whatever, you know. You've done that. If you really want to make your opponent suffer, then maybe what you do is let go, especially if behind your opponent is a sewage pit, a septic tank of sorts. All right? Now, what will happen if you let go? That's what you see in the world. Now, what's ironic and sometimes maddening to those of us who feel like we have a moral compass is those people seem to be celebrating. Yes, because they won. They won the tug of war. Yay! Sewage, sewage, sewage. Yay, they won. They're celebrating. And it makes you mad that they're celebrating. But did they win? The scariest thing that could ever happen would be for God to just let us go. If He just lets us go, it's like cutting the tie out in space. That's what's going on here. The things that you and I are maybe quick to look down our nose at people, the sins that they commit, the problems that they have, things like they're in this list, the habits, and those are themselves the judgment. Those are themselves the consequence. They're not the cause of God letting them go. There's the consequence of God letting them go. Misdirected worship is the cause. Everything else is simply the consequence of that. And that should change our thinking. That's the way God sees it. So you see, in our natural state, thank God we have not been left to our natural state in Christ, but in our natural state, from God's point of view, we are simply dirty, mentally deranged addicts. Those are the three things He mentions after the word let God gave them over. He gave them over to uncleanness. He gave them over to a depraved mind. He gave them over to shameful lusts. We're dirty, mentally deranged addicts in our now natural state. And let me say that has now become the natural state. It seems natural. It seems inevitable. it seems normal, and because we have made all kinds of accommodations and adjustments to it, it seems right. That's the exchange. That's the exchange. That's the consequence of misdirected worship. Do you remember the first approach of Israel, the nation of Israel, to the promised land, when they believed the 10 spies with a negative report instead of the 2 spies with a good report? Remember that? It says that they grumbled and said this, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness." And God was so mad, he said to Moses, "I'm going to wipe them out." Moses says, "Don't do that. People it'll ruin your reputation." So God said, "Okay, there's no bargaining here. All this was planned by God." But God said, "Okay, they're going back in the wilderness for 40 years. They said, 'I wish we had died in the wilderness.' God says, "You get what you want." Right? Later, during the time of the judges, the people fall back into idolatry. Idolatry, right? Because that's the issue. They fall back into idolatry, especially a generation who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel, meaning they didn't pay attention to it. They weren't stupid. And to their response of idolatry, God responded this way. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he, get these words, he gave them over to plunderers. Again, God's anger is manifest in giving them over, in letting people go to a life without his protection and provision at the mercy of predators. All God has to do is let you go, give you what you want, give you what your perverted heart desires, let you worship anything other than him. All God has to do is let that happen, and you will live out the judgment for that. This is hard. This is hard because this seems to be God's MO in judgment. When faced with people's ingratitude, irreverence, and commitment to lesser things, his MO is evidently just to let people go, to give them what they want, to let them suffer the inevitable consequences of their own choice. He lets go of the rope holding them back from the sewage pit of moral and spiritual chaos. He lets go. That's scary. Now, there's some hope. Before I get to that, let me just say a few words about verses 26 and 27. Some wonder why homosexuality of both men and women seems to be singled out for more detailed description, 2 whole verses instead of just a single word. It is a single word in some other passages, but it's not in the single words here. Why 2 whole verses on it? The reason, I think, is pretty clear. It's not because it is a worse sin than others, but because it is an exchange of natural relations for unnatural ones, it says. And so it is a rather vivid example of the result of the great exchange described in verses 23 and 25. It's because it is clearly what? Now, let me just say some things here. First of all, God's original intent for human beings is that sexual desire be aimed at the opposite sex. The bodies of human beings are designed to embody, to live out that desire. That was God's original intent, and I believe still is God's original intent. That is what God would say is natural in the sense of the way he designed nature from the beginning. That is true. And if we're going to love and revere God, we cannot let go of that truth. We do need to understand that in the great exchange that our culture, every human culture has experienced, unnatural has become natural. And people don't understand why you would say anything negative about their positive relationships, and experiences. You need to understand the perspective from which they are coming so you don't seem like a self-righteous prig. You need to understand where they're coming from. God is telling you this morning where they're coming from. That's it, right? Yeah, but it's messed up. Yeah, it's messed up. Just like me thinking about my truck in the middle of worship this morning. That's messed up, yeah. Right, it is. And we also have to understand that we are not in the business of seeing that judgment is done. We are in no position to see that judgment is done for various reasons, not the least of which is it's already done. That's what this passage is saying. There is a future judgment. Yes, there is. Not all wrongs have been righted. That's true. But the moral chaos and sewage pit and misery and suffering that our society evidences is because God has let us go. So here's some takeaways. Wait a minute, we're getting to hope. Wait a minute. Takeaway number one. If you're not brought to your knees in humility, confession, and worship, you have not yet processed what God is saying to us here. What he really wants is undivided worship, devotion, and affection because he's worthy of it. That's what God really wants from human beings, including every human being in this room. That's what he wants. That's what's right for him to have because he's God and because he's good. It is right for him to have that. It is wrong for him not to have that. That's what he wants. And failure to give him that, which we all struggle with, is the sin behind every other sin. The root of your sin is the same as the root of their sin, whoever you might be pointing to out there. The root is the same. Fruit may be different. Consequences may be different. The root is the same. That's why we have to be humble. Being enamored with other things, including jobs, children, achievement, the approval of others, anything, is the fundamental failure of mankind. So, let me ask you this. Are you the Pharisee who said, I thank God that I'm not like those people? Or are you like the publican who said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner? That's takeaway one. Takeaway two. When God looks at the world, including our current American culture, he does not see all the kinds of sins and wickedness that will one day be met with his judgment. He sees a world already swimming in divine judgment, already under condemnation, and already suffering the consequences of the sinful choices of mankind. And he has no pleasure in it. In fact, he has committed himself to a rescue operation centered in his son Jesus. And he is, get this, employing rescued and redeemed humans like you and me in that rescue operation. Are you serious? Barely having the sewage hosed off us, he sends us back to rescue people from the sewage pit. You're still dripping with cleansing from that same sewage. Right? So is this how you're looking at this world, including our current American culture? Let me ask you this. Are you full of disgust or full of compassion? Because you can't be full of both at the same time. Are you like Jonah, who waited for the wicked Ninevites to get what was coming to them? Or are you like Jesus, who prayed for his accusers and executioners, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do? How are you looking at the world? Are you looking at the way God looks at it? And now here's a third takeaway, and here's some good news. And I'm going to just take us to a couple verses from Romans chapter 5. Because thankfully, 18 through 32 is just one passage in the book of Romans. But let me just tell you what chapter 5, verses 9 and 10 says. Since we have now been justified by Jesus' blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that the glorious good news? It just makes you want to just move on from chapter 1, verse 32 to the rest of the book. Of course, chapter 2 isn't going to be much better, just to be a killjoy here, right? But we're getting to chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, right? Here's the good news. God is redeeming people. He's saving people. And let me just put a little fine point on this. When Jesus, by virtue of his death and resurrection, redeems, rescues, forgives, and cleanses sewage-stained humans, when he does that, he claims them, and here's the word, he keeps them. Jesus said, everyone the Father gives me will come to me, and he who comes to me I will never cast away. We are kept by the power of God. We are not let go. I will never leave you or forsake you, says God. Even though in our human nature we deserve to be let go of, Jesus has rescued us, and that rescue is permanent, and guess what? He will hold me fast. He will hold me fast. Listen, it isn't me hanging onto the rope. It's him hanging on to it. It's him hanging on to me. He will hold me fast. Would you stand with me? And we're going to sing that song, He Will Hold Me Fast, as a celebration of the redemption we have in Jesus. In our celebrating and in our gratitude for God's redemption, let us remember to have his view of what moral failure really is, his view of what right and wrong really is, that it's really about worship, and his view of this dark, depraved, lost, damaged, foreign world full of people who he loves. God so loved the world that he gave his Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. God rescues and redeems. May we have his attitude and his mindful, and be grateful that he will hold me fast. Let's sing that together.